37-year-old Dayarbi Kalidas Chaderi, fondly known as DK, has recently emigrated from India to the small town of Dalton, Georgia. He works in the popular convenience store Cancu's Express with co-worker Amanda Tyler.
I'd been working at Cancu's for a couple of years before DK came. I'd come in and open up the deli.
Hey, DK.
Hi.
He would just come back there, help me. He'd help me with anything I needed back there. He got busy, I'd go run up, jump on the other register. We were a team, like probably one of my most favorite coworkers.
DK has only been working at the store for a few months, but has settled in quickly.
Customers love him. Absolutely love him.
Hi there.
I think that's why there were so many regulars, honestly. Could come in, see him, and they could go on about their day and have a better day than they came in with. Just from coming in contact with DK.
DK has just started his regular night shift.
We were definitely a busy convenience store. I mean, we were 24 hours.
See you later. Have a good shift tonight.
A good evening. Yes, sir. How can I help you?
What's your emergency?
There had been a 911 call that there had been someone hurt at the Cancu convenience store off Airport Road in Dalton, Georgia.
A regular customer of DK's, called Mark Rogers, had popped into the store.
We'd always go up to the front and say hey to DK. So when he went up front, we couldn't find him.
Something's not right.
He looks over by the door that goes into the food preparation or that back room. He could see the door was open. He could see DK's feet and a large pool of blood. So that's when he called 911.
Deputies from the Whitfield County Sheriff's Office and GBI agents arrive on scene.
Hey, what do you have?
The ID from the victim's wallet confirms it's DK.
We found out that the victim was an Indian that had not been here very long. He had recently moved from New Jersey.
Thanks.
We try to assess what's happened. Do we have witnesses on scene?
Thanks, officer. Hi, I understand that you made the call to 911.
I did, yes. I came in and couldn't find DK. Then I go into the back room. This doesn't make any sense.
From talking with the witness, he was very liked by the patrons that came in the store. This was a hard-working young man. There was really no reason for anybody to want to kill DK.
Okay, thank you.
One of the first things you want to do is do a walk through the scene to get in your mind exactly what you think happened. From observing the body, we thought there might have been multiple stab wounds. It was hard to tell, but we knew from the amount of blood that it was more than one stab wound that had killed the victim. The victim had bled out and actually died at the scene from blood loss. When someone's stabbed or beaten with an object, the motion that you have, either stabbing or coming back, the blood is literally cast off. And that's a term that we use, is cast off. And it makes a particular pattern on the wall or the scene there. So he knew that it was a violent crime and that the victim had tried to defend himself before all this occurred.
He couldn't have been dead more than a half hour before the call to 911.
Detective Chris Guay is called in to assist in the investigation.
They requested me to come in to start reviewing and downloading video so we can narrow down and identify a suspect. Upon arriving at the scene, looking at the outside of the building, I saw that there were cameras to my left and to my right. Upon entering into the store, I noticed that there were more cameras. One that was facing the register. There was a camera that facing the door, and other cameras in various places. My initial thought is I am hoping that the camera system is working and that we were able to retrieve what footage we would need. To watch the footage, I had to go through a door which led into the back room. There was the victim on the floor, blood all around and just laying there. It was a particularly violent crime scene. To carry on with your work after seeing something like that, you just have to know that your job is important to help identify and locate the suspect so that person can answer for what they have done.
Hey, how's it going? I counted 7 cameras.
Yeah, 7 cameras, all recording.
When I found out that everything was working and that it was recording, I was ecstatic because the video is going to help you figure out who your perpetrator is, who did this.
Let's start earlier this evening, around 9 p.m.
That's him.
The victim was working by himself at night. He was working the night shift.
When you look at the first clip, when DK's behind the counter, he's very cordial to all the people that come in. They're very cordial back to him. He's very friendly and helpful.
He starts walking back towards the back office area, the kitchen area, where the incident took place, and he appears to be calm, like nothing is going on yet.
What's that?
Play that.
Something catches his attention. He's chased into this room. He tries to close the door behind him. It's at that point that the door is hit and the door opens.
He really doesn't have a chance to defend himself and pushes him into that back room, out of the sight of that camera.
It's at that point that we switch camera angles.
You can see the victim knocking away the gun. And then a knife coming out and him being attacked with the knife. The victim is then stabbed several times.
Duct tape is put on his face.
Well, they're taping his mouth so he won't scream.
The suspect squats and is kind of just watching.
It's like someone observing their prey.
You can see that the suspect at one point starts to smother Mr. Chatahari.
They're trying to speed up the process.
It's brutal. It's just absolutely brutal.
This was very cold and calculated. To sit there and suffocate someone and to push down on their chest to where their heart would pump more blood out, it was just totally unnecessary. The victim was already dying. There was no need for any of that. It was just horrible to watch.
I'm thinking to myself, who could do this?
Investigators replay the footage to get a better look at the suspect.
They had a white hoodie tied up very tightly around their face with sunglasses on. So you could not describe the person as either a man or a woman.
All right, let's see if there's anyone up front.
While the incident is taking place, there's customers that come into the store to make a purchase. There's items that are placed on the counter. And you can see the customers waiting to the point you would think that they heard something and they're trying to figure out what's going on. One of the customers walks towards the door. And then goes back towards the front, just waiting to pay for their stuff.
I have no idea what's going on in there.
The suspect goes to the register. And at one point, there's some dialogue back and forth between the suspect and the customer. In my opinion, the suspect acts as an employee to tell the people to leave. Seeing that and knowing how brutal it was happening and what was going on, it was a shock that nothing happened to that person, that they were able to leave unscathed.
All right, I'm gonna go up front and see if there's anyone who can help us.
Yeah.
We started interviewing DK's friends and bosses to get a better picture of what kind of person DK was, if he had any enemies, if he had any grudges, if he had someone who was really trying to kill him. And we found that he didn't. That made this a stranger-on-stranger crime, which makes it a lot more difficult for us to be able to locate the killer. This was just a very violent attack, and we need to find this person quick, because they're going to do this again.
I was at home, and I remember picking my phone up to check it. I had text messages, voicemails, missed phone calls, where everybody was trying to get a hold of me. I called and I was like, what's going on at the store?
Hey, I got your message. What's going on?
When I found out that DK had been murdered, I just felt blank. Like I had lost my best friend, like somebody had killed my brother. I didn't believe it at first. I didn't think that he was gone. Thought it was a dream I needed to wake up from. I didn't believe that somebody had came into the store and done something like that.
Investigators continue to watch the surveillance footage to see what the suspect does next.
After the customers that had come into the store left, there was nobody else on scene besides the victim and the suspect. The suspect goes to the register.
They emptied the cash register.
Zoom in.
And it looks like we're wearing gloves.
They're taking the lottery tickets.
You see the suspect with the lottery tickets that were taken, goes back to the back room where Mr. Chatahari is laying, and takes these items and puts them into this black duffel bag that was being carried by the suspect. The suspect puts it over the shoulder and then leaves out from behind and walks straight out. Once they go through the door, you lose view from the internal cameras.
Let's switch to the outside camera.
I switched to an external right view that looks down into the left of the store. And you see the suspect walking kind of in a diagonal towards the road away from the store in more of an easterly direction. no car, only on foot, which leaves us no vehicle description to put a lookout for. Since we have no vehicle, we don't know who the individual is. We're at a point that we don't have information to give to the public to help try to identify the suspect, to locate the suspect. And it's extremely frustrating.
Let's see when the suspect arrived.
So we start watching footage to see if we can get the suspect coming into the store. Kind of in a backwards, like you're watching the movie in reverse. So we're watching the video. We still don't have somebody coming into the store wearing a white hoodie. But we have an individual coming into the store that's wearing a black tie jacket. But also, this subject has a black duffel bag with them. It's got the same bag as the suspect. Nobody else had come in carrying a black bag. We only had the individual that was wearing the black jacket and the black bag come in and then go towards the restroom.
The customer carrying the black bag disappears into a restroom in a camera blind spot.
What was that?
The plan.
That's him.
And it's the same area that the suspect comes out wearing a white hoodie, carrying a black bag, and then committing the crime. We watched lots of video just to try to see if we missed something.
Let's get a better view. Switch back to the camera covering the entrance.
Let me bring up the other image. It's them for sure, one and the same.
That was the moment that we realized.
We captured the killer coming in the store, and we see them go to the bathroom, and they've changed clothes trying to disguise themselves. So that was a huge break for us.
Detectives expand the search outside the store to see if there are any more surveillance cameras.
I'm in the parking lot of the Cancun's. I look across the street, I look over, and I see the Kangaroo convenience store. In past cases I have worked, I know that they have a camera that captures the front of the store of the Cancun's from across the street. We needed to get a copy of that video.
Because that gives us another opportunity to possibly find out which direction that the killer left.
I'd like to make a request for a warrant for CCTV footage from last night.
That camera that faces the Cancun's from the Kangaroo convenience store, that could be the camera that breaks the case.
A Whitfield County crime scene technician is processing the back room where DK was murdered.
He started by taking photographs and measurements of the items of evidence and marking the evidence. The crime scene technician kind of looks down, and underneath the fryer there's some kind of object, so he looks a little bit further, takes a picture, and it's a phone. He'd probably gotten kicked there during the scuffle with the victim and the perpetrator. We figured that it was probably going to be the victim's phone or the perpetrator's phone. That was a great piece of evidence for us to find, because we knew from that point on that we could do a forensic phone exam and get the identity of the phone's owner.
The video from the Kangaroo convenience store was brought to me at the sheriff's office.
The Cancun store can be seen in the distance. Detective Guay looks for any sign of the suspect fleeing the scene.
While I'm watching the footage, we see numerous vehicles pulling in and out.
I can't see our suspect. Rewind it back to about 9 p.m.
Detectives try to spot the suspect arriving at the scene.
One vehicle in particular pulls up to a gas pump and stops. and a subject gets out of that vehicle wearing the same white hoodie that the suspect comes out the restroom at the Cancun's and then committing the crime.
Change cameras.
The person goes into the store. This is the first time we really get a good look at who we believe to be as the suspect.
Pause there, zoom in.
You can see the curly blonde hair. And that's when you have that moment of, oh my gosh. The whole time, we're thinking that this is a man that committed this murder. But this was kind of the aha moment of, it's a woman.
We've got a really clear picture of her with no disguise, and it gives us just a tremendous break, too, in the case.
She took no effort to conceal her identity at the gas station directly across the street from the murder, apparently assuming that no one would ever investigate beyond the gas station where she actually killed the person.
After some time, she gets back in the vehicle. This gives us our first vehicle description, our first somewhat of a lead as to what the person was driving. And it was a greenish Kia Soul.
Pause. Zoom in on that tag.
We can't get a full vehicle registration tag picture, but we can tell what kind of car it is. We got that out as quick as we could to help other agencies around not have any more crimes happen to them.
Okay, play on.
She drives off in the direction that the murder suspect walked towards after the murder was committed.
Her car never appears on the Cancun gas station video system, so she appears to have parked it further away and walked up to not allow herself to be identified by the car she's driving.
Next, investigators interview Charles Branson, the customer who interacted with the suspect after the killing. He makes himself known to police after hearing about the murder.
I went and got a Coke and a bag of Fagos.
Bag of chips.
Yep, and I put them up on the counter, and I put my card up there.
What did she say?
She was like, "We're not open to business."
That's what she said?
Yeah. I was like, "Not open to business?" I said, "I'm just getting my debit card back." She said, "Me don't have your debit card." And she's talking like she's a Middle Eastern girl, but I could tell she wasn't.
She used a fake voice when telling the witnesses and the patrons that came in the store to leave. She used broken English and an accent to try to confuse them. It's a lot of pressure on us to find out who did this crime and to bring them to justice and make sure they don't hurt anybody else.
The local community was shocked to find out about the murder, particularly because there was no immediate arrest.
All of our regular customers were shocked because it's just not something that happens around here regularly. People don't just walk in convenience stores and decide they're gonna murder the clerk and steal a few bucks and some lottery tickets.
A lot of people that had known Mr. Chowdhury came in, talked to other employees, expressed their condolences and their regrets about what had happened. And, you know, there was just a lot of concern for his family and friends. One of the crime scene technicians for Whitfield County was very excited. They actually were able to unlock the phone and get into it. As they looked at the photographs on the phone, they realized this doesn't appear to be the victim's phone. There are no pictures of him or pictures from the store or anything like that.
And we realized from watching the store surveillance video that the pictures on the phone are the person in the store surveillance video.
And so that's why they realized, hey, we've actually got the suspect's phone.
We were able to get her identification data, her social media pages, and it gave us more pictures to compare to the videos.
Yeah, her name's Sky Mims.
We know who's done this now, and it was a tremendous break for us.
Sky Mims had no prior criminal history. She turned 21 years of age just days prior to the murder. We found that she had a pretty significant presence on the internet compared to an average person.
We realized she wasn't your normal perpetrator. This was a young woman who had come down from Detroit to try to get into the hip-hop rap music business in Atlanta.
Say what it used to be. I want to lose me. I'm chasing cream like kids chasing Mr. Frosty through the streets and new album moving scene. From any G-Spin usually. No other rappers are doing me.
And that she had tried to come down here to do that. And that was her purpose in being in Georgia.
What's up? Joe Sky, and I just want to know if I can be your obsession.
Detectives search their database to see if they can locate Sky Mims.
What's your current address?
Nothing in Georgia.
We released the picture of Sky Mims to the local media through the Atlanta area and the Dalton area. We realized that we needed to let the public know that this was a dangerous person. If she had done this crime, that she would do another. And we needed to find her and find her fast. It was Tuesday afternoon, we got a phone call that Sky Mims was at a location in Bartow County, Georgia, which is about 30 to 45 minutes south of Dalton, at a home there.
We'll reach out to the Marshal Service straight away.
The United States Marshal Service, especially in Northwest Georgia and the Atlanta Division, are great at hunting fugitives. We have a really good relationship with them, so we turned that part of the case over to them to allow them to try to find Sky Mims and bring her in.
Marshal Chip Ashley joins the task force assigned to locate and arrest Sky Mims.
Once I get the request for assistance, I called the case agent, and he explained to me what he needed. They had a tip that Miss Mims was in the house, and they had already set up surveillance on the house. They had located a vehicle. They relayed information back to the GBI agents and the Whitfield County Sheriff's Office. And in speaking with them, they were able to verify that that fit the description of the vehicle that Sky Mims was driving at the time of the incident.
Yeah, green Kia Soul. That's correct.
A search of the car's tag number reveals it has been stolen by someone fitting Sky Mims' description.
Vehicle leaves the residence and we do a traffic stop. The person inside identifies Sky Mims and says that she is in fact in the residence.
While the Kia Soul is seized for evidence, the marshals approach the house.
Typically, immediately after a crime, people have more of a tendency to continue to be violent. So that was a problem for us. And we did not know how she would take it once she was confronted by us. On arrival, the door was open. I tried to get her to come out. I knocked and announced police.
Police, come out with your hands raised.
No response. I was very apprehensive. You're always apprehensive when you're dealing with cases like this, but you have to remain calm. Upon entry, I observe a stairwell in front of me, and it goes up to my right. I held on that so my team members could clear the main floor of the residence. And while I'm holding on the stairwell, I'm calling out to Sky.
You need to come out and show us your hands.
No response for a few moments. And then all of a sudden, she pops out. Miss Mims was completely naked, and she would only show me one of her hands. And she was screaming,
Shoot me. Come on and just shoot me!
She wanted us to believe that she was armed and that she was going to hurt us. She wanted us to take her life.
Just show me your other hand. We're not here to hurt you.
Sky Mims was in a very desperate situation in her mind. She knew she had committed a murder, and she knew that she was about to have to face up to the consequences.
Show us your hands and come downstairs.
She showed me her other hand, And then she started coming down the stairs where she was taken into custody. And we put a sheet over her to cover her up. I just get an eerie feeling every time you apprehend a murder suspect. It's evil. I mean, that's just the only way I can explain it. Sky Mims showed no remorse. She was angry that we were there. She was angry that she was going to have to face the consequences for what she had done.
Sky Mims was placed in the back of the patrol car and transported to the Bartow County Sheriff's Office.
Jeremy.
Go ahead.
She's doing something to herself.
Okay, what do you mean? Stand by just a second.
She took off her cuffs.
Pull over.
If you want, I can put that back on.
She was able to remove the handcuffs, and she showed them to the deputy. So they had to stop again.
You're gonna stay seated right there. You're gonna put your hands behind your back. You understand? If you do not do that, when this door opens, I'm gonna tase you. Do you understand? We're not gonna fight with you.
Oh,
You understand?
did. I see that the war started, so I'll just
Put your hands behind your back.
Whatever.
Do not move from right there. You understand?
He repositioned her and reattached the handcuffs to her and secure her in the vehicle again.
Be advised, she's been re-handcuffed behind her back.
What if I attacked you? Would you shoot me in my head? I would rather die.
She kept telling the deputy that he needed to kill her.
Now she just shot me. I should have fought.
The lottery tickets that were taken from the store after the murder were found in the bedroom where she was staying. Some of those were in a trash can, were ones that had been scratched off and were not winners. But there was a smaller batch of tickets that had been scratched off and had been winners, from anywhere from a free ticket to small amounts of money that were rubber banded together and apparently intending to cash those in. The murder weapon was found in her car. Gloves that she was wearing during the attack were found in the back seat floorboard area of the car that she was driving.
She brandished a gun at first during the robbery, and the victim quickly knocked it away. We recovered that as well. So in the search of the vehicle and the home, we found a tremendous amount of evidence.
The gloves, knife, and gun are all sent to the lab for DNA testing.
This is the only case I've ever prosecuted in 30 years where I was invited to the victim's funeral. And I honored that invitation. I went to the funeral, and there was an enormous number of people.
It was difficult to walk in and see him laying there, knowing that I'm not going to get to talk to him anymore. It was rough.
He was not born and raised here, had only lived in this area for a few months, really, at the time. But we're a community of immigrants in a lot of ways, so there was just a lot of support for him and for his family. After her arrest, Sky Mims was brought back to Dalton to the Whitfield County Jail.
What is that, a Kia? Is that yours? Is that somebody else's? You can borrow it? What?
Are you psychic or something?
Am I psychic? No.
You sure?
Are you?
You're getting red. No comment.
The first question we asked her, she was like, no comment, and started giggling.
If you have any more questions, I'd like to answer them when I have a lawyer.
Okay.
Nothing else to say. The job, obviously, no. Just don't understand. Whatever.
She ultimately ended the interview asking for an attorney.
It's very frustrating for us because we had worked so hard on this case and gotten her into custody, so quickly for such a brutal crime. You really wanted to know some answers, and she wasn't giving any.
Sky Mims is charged with the murder of B.K. Chaderi. Her DNA is taken and sent to the lab to compare to the gloves and the knife found in the car.
The gloves that Sky Mims used during the murder were found to have blood on the outside of them. That blood matched DNA of the victim's blood. The insides of the gloves were also tested, and touch DNA from her hands was found and matched to her DNA, showing that she had had her hands inside the gloves at some point.
We found the victim's blood on the knife. It also had DNA from Sky Mims herself.
It was a very long, thin-bladed knife. Went into his side and hit his aorta, which caused massive bleeding.
I don't think there's anything anyone could have done to help him or help him survive that wound. It was just a fatal wound.
The kangaroo surveillance footage reveals a final piece of evidence against Sky Mims.
She's at the registry, and she actually uses her own credit card to pay for the gas. So from that video and that timestamp, we were able to get the financial records connecting that credit card back to her as well. So that was very helpful.
On May 29, 2014, a Whitfield County grand jury indicts Mims for malice murder, 4 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, armed robbery, burglary, possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, and theft by bringing stolen property into the state. She pleads not guilty to all charges.
What we could put together from the surveillance videos that we recovered was that Sky Mims was at the Kangaroo for a brief period of time. When the Kangaroo convenience store closed early, that's when she went across the street to the Cancun convenience store. She came inside, went into the bathroom, changed clothes from dark clothes into lighter clothes. Very quickly, when the victim wasn't looking, got up on him and rushed him, got him into the back room, and that's where she stabbed him. Then she went out to the cash register, took the money and the lottery tickets, and walked casually out the door and disappeared.
Sky Mims' behavior was shocking to the extent that it was premeditated, how aggressively she attacked the victim, how brutally she killed him. I had never seen anything, certainly on video, that was that ruthless and cold-blooded and just remorseless.
Prosecutors have a theory as to Sky Mims' motive.
Sky Mims, in the day or two before the murder, had purchased a lottery ticket where if you won the grand prize, you would get $500 a week for the rest of your life. She became obsessed with that ticket. That if she had $500 a week coming in for the rest of her life, that she could pursue an art career, a music career, a modeling career, and not have to worry about that basic level of income. After she murdered Mr. Chaudhary, the primary thing that she stole from the store were lottery tickets, and that specific $500 a week per life lottery ticket. She took nearly an entire roll, and those were the tickets that were found in her car and at the place where she was staying, where she had methodically gone through scratching them out, hoping to find a grand prize winner. On Wednesday, April 11th, 2015, Sky Mims was found guilty of all charges by a jury and was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The Georgia Supreme Court drops the theft conviction 4 years later.
I was ecstatic that she was actually going to get what she deserved, because he didn't deserve that at all.
In my career, 17 years as a detective, this is the only homicide that I've ever assisted with or worked that has ever been captured on video. It's rare. It just doesn't happen. And so it's something that I'll take with me forever.
I remember watching the video, and I remember screaming at it and saying, DK, fight back. But he fought back enough to where he caught his own killer just by knocking her phone out of her pocket. I feel like DK's with God now and living his best life. No more hurt, no more pain. I feel like he's good now.
Next Wednesday on See No Evil.
What's that?
The victim is stabbed several times.
It's just absolutely brutal. Who could do this?
On a quiet day in 1979 in Honolulu, life moved with a kind of steady rhythm that rarely suggested anything could suddenly go missing. The city, set against the backdrop of ocean and volcanic land, carried on in its familiar pattern of routines, workdays, and ordinary movements that rarely drew attention. In that environment, Peter Boyer was just another man navigating his own schedule, someone with responsibilities, obligations, and the predictable structure of daily life. Nothing about that day, at least from what is known, indicated that it would become anything other than ordinary. And yet, by the time the day ended, Peter Boyer was gone. There was no dramatic warning, no public disturbance, no immediate indication that anything had gone wrong in real time. He simply left home, as many people do, carrying nothing unusual, showing no known signs of distress or preparation for departure. There was no evidence that he intended to leave permanently, and nothing in his known circumstances suggested a sudden withdrawal from his life. He did not appear to be planning a disappearance. He did not leave behind the kind of structured trail that people sometimes do when they intend to step away deliberately. What makes this case unsettling is not just the disappearance itself, but the absence of everything that usually surrounds a disappearance. There was no final confirmed conversation that investigators could rely on. No recorded farewell. No documented shift in behavior that could be traced back and interpreted as a turning point. Even the smallest anchors that usually help reconstruct a person's final movements were missing. It was as if the moment he left home, the narrative of his life stopped being visible to anyone else. In most missing person cases, there is at least a fragment of continuity. A sighting, a phone call, a transaction, a witness who remembers something slightly out of place. But in this case, the record begins to dissolve almost immediately. The timeline becomes unclear, not because there are competing accounts, but because there are none that can be firmly established. That absence of clarity is what makes the case difficult to approach even decades later. It is not that the story is complicated in its details. It is that the details simply are not there. At some point after he left home, Peter Boyer ceased to appear in any confirmed way. That fact alone would be troubling in any context, but it becomes more significant when considered alongside what is known about his circumstances. He was a businessman with an apparently stable life. There were no known indicators of financial collapse or personal crisis. There were no documented signs that he was attempting to distance himself from his environment or obligations. In cases where individuals choose to disappear voluntarily, there are often traces of preparation, even if subtle. A withdrawal of funds, a quiet arrangement of affairs, or some indication of intent. None of that has been established here. Instead, what remains is a gap. That gap is where concern begins to grow. Because when a person with no known reason to vanish suddenly cannot be located, the absence itself becomes the central piece of evidence. It forces investigators and family members into a position where they must interpret silence as information. But silence is not stable. It does not point in one direction. It expands into multiple possibilities, none of which can be confirmed without additional evidence. As the initial hours passed and then days, the lack of contact became increasingly difficult to explain. There was no message explaining absence, no indication of delay or change of plans, no secondary communication that might suggest confusion or interruption rather than disappearance. The expectation in any normal circumstance is that absence resolves itself through contact. A person returns, or explains, or is located through routine tracking of their movements. But in this case, the expected resolution never arrived. One of the earliest and most significant developments in the case was the discovery of his vehicle. It was located abandoned, but not in a place that aligned with his known routine or expected movements. This detail became central very quickly because vehicles often serve as transitional evidence in missing person investigations. They can indicate direction of travel, final stops, or points of confrontation. They can hold traces of movement or struggle, or sometimes provide clarity through location alone. In this instance, however, the vehicle did not fulfill any of those roles in a meaningful way. It was present, but it did not explain. It did not point clearly toward a destination or an event. It did not contain visible signs of struggle that might indicate a struggle had taken place. It did not offer the kind of physical narrative that investigators could build upon. Instead, it stood as a silent object, disconnected from context, difficult to interpret beyond the fact of its abandonment. That silence within the vehicle mirrors the broader silence of the case itself. Each piece of expected information seems to be missing or incomplete. The absence is not confined to one element, but spreads across every layer of investigation. There is no confirmed witness who can reliably place Peter Boyer at a specific time and location after he left home. There is no documented communication that marks his movements. There is no physical evidence that clearly indicates what occurred between the moment he was last seen and the moment he was no longer present. As investigators began to assess the situation, the early assumption that he might have voluntarily left his life quickly became difficult to sustain. In cases of voluntary disappearance, there is usually at least a traceable intention. Even when people attempt to vanish, they tend to leave behind patterns that can be followed retroactively. Financial movement, contact with new environments, or some form of logistical preparation typically appears when examined closely enough. In this case, those markers were not found in the information available. This absence created a shift in interpretation. The case moved away from the idea of planned departure and toward the possibility of an abrupt and involuntary event. But even that direction did not provide answers. Because while involuntary disappearance can suggest external involvement, it usually leaves traces of conflict or interaction, something to indicate resistance, confrontation, or force. Yet the available information does not confirm such traces. The physical evidence that was recovered, limited as it is, does not clearly support a narrative of struggle. What remains, then, is uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. The emotional weight of such cases often develops slowly. At first, there is confusion, then concern, then the gradual realization that normal explanations are not sufficient. Families begin to search for patterns that might not exist. Investigators begin to revisit assumptions that once seemed reasonable. And as time passes, the absence of new information becomes its own kind of presence, filling the space where answers should be. In the case of Peter Boyer, that absence has persisted. It is not defined by dramatic revelations or shifting conclusions. It is defined by stasis. The case does not move forward because there is nothing new to move it forward. Each known element remains fixed. A man leaves home, no confirmed sightings follow, no communication is recorded, and a vehicle is found abandoned without clear signs of what happened inside or around it. The difficulty of this case lies not in interpreting conflicting evidence, but in the lack of evidence itself. There is no clear path of reconstruction, no sequence that can be confidently retraced. Instead, there is only a boundary between what is known and what is not, and that boundary does not appear to shift with time. And so the question that emerges is not simply about what happened, but about how something like this can happen without leaving a trace that can be followed back. How a person can move from presence to absence without a detectable transition that allows investigators to bridge the gap. That question becomes the foundation of everything that follows in this case. Peter Boyer was not a man defined by spectacle or public attention. Everything that can be understood about him begins with a sense of quiet normality, the kind of life that does not invite scrutiny until something breaks the expected pattern. In 1979 in Honolulu, he was known as a businessman with a stable position, someone who operated within the boundaries of ordinary professional life. There was no public controversy attached to his name, no documented criminal association, and no known financial collapse that might explain a sudden disruption. His life, at least from the available information, was structured in a way that suggested continuity rather than instability. That stability is central to why his disappearance remains so difficult to interpret. In many missing person cases, the background of the individual provides the first layer of explanation. Financial pressure, personal conflict, emotional distress, or legal trouble can often offer direction to an investigation, even if they do not immediately solve it. In this case, however, those usual reference points appear absent. There is no recorded indication that Peter Boyer was facing extraordinary pressure or imminent crisis. There is no known narrative of escalating personal difficulty that might suggest he was approaching a breaking point. Instead, what exists is a portrait of routine life. A man moving through predictable responsibilities, maintaining his professional role, and living without documented disruption. This does not make the case less mysterious. It makes it more so, because it removes the common interpretive frameworks that investigators often rely on when trying to reconstruct the final movements of a missing individual. Honolulu itself in 1979 forms an important part of the backdrop, not because it provides answers, but because it defines the environment in which this disappearance occurred. It was a city shaped by both urban structure and geographic isolation, a place where communities were relatively contained and where unusual events tended to stand out. Yet it was also a place where the natural landscape, with its dense vegetation, volcanic terrain, and surrounding ocean, created areas that could conceal activity or reduce visibility. This duality between structured city life and expansive natural environment is part of the context in which any investigation in Hawaii must be understood. Within this setting, Peter Boyer's daily life would not have appeared remarkable. There is no indication that he lived in isolation or that he was disconnected from normal social or professional interactions. He existed within a recognizable framework of work and routine. That framework is important because it highlights how ordinary his presence was before the disappearance. Nothing about his known circumstances suggests that he was already partially removed from his environment or disengaging from it in stages. There is no evidence of gradual withdrawal that might precede a voluntary disappearance. Equally important is what is not present in the record. There are no documented disputes involving significant financial debt. There are no confirmed legal problems. There are no recorded threats or warnings that might indicate external pressure. There is no indication of a pattern of behavior that would suggest he was being drawn into danger. The absence of these elements does not eliminate possibilities, but it removes the usual scaffolding that investigators often use to build early theories. When examining a person's life before disappearance, investigators typically look for fractures in routine, changes in spending behavior, shifts in communication patterns, sudden alterations in relationships, or unusual travel activity. In this case, none of those indicators are clearly established in the available information. That lack of transitional behavior is one of the defining features of the case. It suggests continuity right up until the moment of disappearance, which makes the break itself appear abrupt and unexplained. The emotional profile of a missing person case is often shaped by what those close to the individual remember. Family members and colleagues usually provide fragments of personality, habits, and recent interactions that can help reconstruct a timeline. However, in this case, the information provided does not include specific accounts of final conversations or notable behavioral changes. There is no confirmed last sighting that can be anchored in time with certainty. There is no documented exchange that serves as a final reference point before he vanished from all known contact. This absence of a clear final interaction is particularly significant. It means that the transition from presence to absence is not only unexplained, but also unbounded. Without a confirmed last moment of contact, the timeline becomes diffuse. The investigation cannot begin from a precise endpoint, which complicates every attempt to move backward and reconstruct events. Peter Boyer's identity as a businessman also plays a role in how the case is understood, not because of what he did professionally, but because of what that role implies about structure and routine. Business life typically involves predictable patterns of engagement, scheduled meetings, and documented interactions. It creates a trail of activity that can often be followed in missing person investigations. Yet there is no indication in the provided information that such a trail extended beyond his disappearance. There is no mention of financial transactions or professional communications that could help extend the timeline of his known movements. This absence of traceable activity contributes to the sense that the disappearance occurred in a relatively narrow window of time. He leaves home, and shortly after that point, the record becomes unclear. The narrowing of that window does not bring clarity, however. Instead, it compresses uncertainty into a smaller space, making the moment of disappearance feel more immediate and more difficult to explain. The fact that he did not carry unusual items when he left home also reinforces this impression. There was no indication of travel preparation, no accumulation of belongings that would suggest a planned absence. He did not appear to be equipped for a prolonged departure. This detail is important because it directly affects how voluntary disappearance is evaluated. When individuals leave intentionally, they often leave behind material evidence of planning, even if subtle. The absence of such indicators in this case weakens that interpretation, though it does not entirely eliminate it. At the same time, there is no evidence provided that suggests he was forcibly taken at the moment he left home. There is no confirmed witness account of an abduction or confrontation. There is no recorded disturbance at the point of departure. This creates a difficult investigative position where neither voluntary departure nor forced disappearance is clearly supported by available facts. The environment around him, therefore, becomes an important but limited source of interpretation. Honolulu in 1979 was not a place where disappearances were common in the public perception, and this contributes to the sense of abnormality surrounding the case. However, environmental context alone cannot explain individual outcomes. It can only frame the conditions in which events occurred. What remains consistent across all available information is the absence of escalation before disappearance. There is no documented buildup of events that might suggest a developing crisis. There is no known sequence of incidents leading toward a turning point. Instead, there is a continuity of ordinary life followed by an abrupt cessation of contact and visibility. This contrast between normalcy and disappearance is what defines Peter Boyer's case at its core. It is not a story of gradual decline or visible descent into danger. It is a story of a stable existence that suddenly becomes untraceable. The lack of transitional evidence makes it difficult to categorize the disappearance within familiar investigative patterns. Even the discovery of his vehicle, while significant, does not alter this background understanding of his life. It does not connect back to a known conflict or behavioral change. It exists as a single point of physical evidence without a clearly defined relationship to his personal history. In that sense, it stands apart from the life narrative rather than extending it. As investigators and those close to the case attempt to understand who Peter Boyer was in the context of his disappearance, they are left with a portrait defined more by absence than by detail. He is described through what is not present in the record: no known crisis, no confirmed final communication, no established pattern of withdrawal, and no clear indication of intent to disappear. This absence of defining disruption is what makes his case persist as an unresolved mystery. It removes the usual psychological and situational anchors that help explain why people go missing. Without those anchors, the case resists classification. What remains is a life that appears ordinary until the moment it cannot be accounted for anymore. And that transition, from known routine to complete uncertainty, is where the mystery begins to take shape. The day Peter Boyer disappeared does not begin with anything unusual in the record that survives. There is no indication of a disturbance, no documented interruption to his normal routine, and no evidence that anyone around him perceived that the day would unfold differently from any other. In cases where a person vanishes without explanation, investigators often begin by searching for the earliest deviation from routine, the first moment where something no longer fits the expected pattern. In this case, however, the available information does not provide such a moment. The sequence begins with normality and remains within that framework until it abruptly does not continue at all. Peter Boyer left his home on what is described as a typical day. He did not carry unusual items with him. There was no sign that he was preparing for a long journey, no indication that he was planning to be away for an extended period, and no evidence that he was leaving behind his life in any structured or intentional way. This detail is significant because it establishes the baseline of the investigation. When someone departs without preparation, it narrows certain possibilities while expanding others, but in this case it does neither in a conclusive way. It simply adds to the uncertainty. There is no confirmed final interaction recorded in the available information. No definitive witness account places him in a specific location after his departure that can be used as a reliable anchor point. This absence is not merely a missing detail, it is the foundation of the case's difficulty. Without a confirmed last sighting, investigators cannot establish a precise timeline for the disappearance. They are instead forced to work with a collapsing structure of probability rather than a stable sequence of events. What is known is that at some point after leaving home, Peter Boyer ceased to be traceable through normal means. There are no recorded communications that can be definitively linked to him after his departure. No phone calls, no messages, and no confirmed contact with colleagues, friends, or family. In most disappearance cases, even when individuals are not immediately located, there is often a trail of partial communication that allows investigators to reconstruct movement. In this case, that trail does not appear in the available record. As the hours passed, the absence of contact began to stand out against the expectation of normal return or communication. In ordinary circumstances, a person who leaves home during the day will reappear within a predictable time frame or make contact if plans change. The lack of any such development gradually shifted the situation from routine absence to concern. However, even this shift remains abstract because there is no documented moment where alarm was formally triggered at a specific time. Instead, the concern emerges as a logical consequence of absence rather than a recorded reaction to a specific event. The discovery of Peter Boyer's vehicle introduces the first tangible piece of physical evidence in the case, but it does not resolve the timeline or clarify the sequence of events. The vehicle was found abandoned in a location that did not correspond with his expected or routine movements. This discrepancy is important because it suggests a break in normal travel behavior, yet it does not explain how or why that break occurred. The vehicle itself does not contain visible indicators of what transpired. There are no reported signs of struggle inside it, no clear physical evidence that can reconstruct an encounter, and no items described as pointing toward a specific conclusion. In investigative terms, a vehicle in a missing person case often serves as a transitional object, something that connects the known life of the individual to the unknown circumstances of their disappearance. It can indicate direction, intention, or interruption. It can sometimes contain forensic traces that narrow the range of possibilities. In this case, however, the vehicle does not fulfill that function in any decisive way. It exists as an isolated point of evidence, disconnected from a broader explanatory framework. The absence of witnesses is another defining feature of the case. There is no confirmed testimony that places Peter Boyer in a situation of conflict or distress at the time of his disappearance. There is no recorded observation of unusual behavior that might suggest he was being followed, threatened, or coerced. The lack of eyewitness accounts limits the ability to reconstruct the final moments of his known movements. It also reinforces the sense that the disappearance occurred without public visibility, in a space where no external observer can provide clarification. Investigators face the additional challenge of an incomplete timeline. Without a confirmed last sighting, they could not establish a clear starting point for reconstructing events after his departure from home. This creates a fundamental gap in the investigative process. In most cases, the timeline serves as the backbone of inquiry, allowing each piece of evidence to be placed in relation to a sequence of known events. In this case, the backbone itself is fragmented, making it difficult to attach evidence to a coherent structure. As the investigation progressed, attention naturally turned toward the possibility of voluntary disappearance. This hypothesis is often considered in cases where an individual leaves without clear signs of struggle or abduction. However, the available information does not strongly support this interpretation. There is no indication that Peter Boyer engaged in financial withdrawal or asset liquidation prior to his disappearance. There is no evidence that he arranged for extended absence or established new contact channels elsewhere. There are no documented preparations that would typically accompany a planned departure from one's established life. At the same time, the evidence does not clearly support the opposite conclusion of forced disappearance. There are no confirmed reports of confrontation at the point of departure. There is no physical evidence described that directly indicates an abduction scenario. The lack of such indicators creates a situation in which neither primary explanatory model is fully supported by the available data. This dual absence of supporting evidence creates a unique investigative tension. The case does not lean clearly toward one interpretation over another. Instead, it remains suspended between possibilities, with each potential explanation weakened by missing or incomplete information. In such circumstances, investigators are often forced to maintain multiple hypotheses simultaneously, none of which can be confirmed. The environmental context of Honolulu in 1979 adds complexity but does not resolve uncertainty. The city structure, combining urban environments with natural landscapes, means that there are areas where visibility and traceability can decrease significantly. However, the available information does not indicate that Peter Boyer's disappearance can be directly attributed to environmental factors. The geography provides a backdrop, but it does not supply a mechanism or explanation for the disappearance itself. As time passed beyond the initial disappearance, the absence of new evidence became increasingly significant. In many cases, missing persons are eventually located or traced through indirect evidence, such as financial activity or communication attempts. In this case, there is no indication in the provided information that such developments occurred. The investigative trail appears to have stalled relatively early, with no progression into later stages of reconstruction or identification of suspects. The central difficulty in analyzing the incident lies in the compression of all known events into a very narrow and poorly defined window. Peter Boyer leaves home, and shortly thereafter, he becomes untraceable. The vehicle is later discovered, but it does not extend the timeline in a meaningful way. Between those points, there is no confirmed sequence of events that can be reliably reconstructed. This lack of continuity is what defines the incident phase of the case. It is not a sequence of escalating events leading to disappearance, but rather a sudden transition from presence to absence without intermediate stages that can be clearly documented. The result is a narrative gap that cannot be filled with certainty based on the available information. What remains after examining the known details of the day is a structure built almost entirely on absence. There is absence of confirmed sightings, absence of communication, absence of physical evidence indicating struggle, and absence of preparatory behavior suggesting voluntary departure. Each of these absences removes a potential pathway toward explanation, leaving the incident itself difficult to classify within conventional investigative categories. The day ends in the same way it begins in the record, without closure. There is no documented return, no confirmed contact, and no established resolution to the sequence of events initiated by his departure. The incident, as far as it can be reconstructed, does not conclude with explanation. It concludes with disappearance that remains unaccounted for within the available evidence. The investigation into the disappearance of Peter Boyer began with a problem that would define every stage that followed. There was no clear starting point anchored by reliable last sighting evidence, and there was no established sequence of events that could be confidently reconstructed. In most missing person investigations, the early phase depends heavily on establishing a timeline through witnesses, communication records, and physical traces that can be ordered chronologically. In this case, however, each of those foundational elements was either missing or incomplete, forcing investigators to work outward from a single confirmed fact: Peter Boyer left home and never returned. The first major development in the investigation was the discovery of his vehicle. This object quickly became the central physical reference point in the case, not because it provided answers, but because it was the only tangible link between his known life and his unknown fate. The vehicle was found abandoned in a location that did not correspond with his expected or routine movements. This inconsistency immediately raised questions about how and why it had ended up there, but the absence of additional evidence inside or around it limited the ability to answer those questions. Investigators carefully examined the vehicle for signs that might indicate what had occurred. In many cases, a car can reveal traces of struggle, forced entry, sudden interruption of travel, or other indicators of an event that occurred within or around it. However, in this instance, The available information does not describe any visible signs of struggle inside the vehicle. There are no reported physical traces that clearly suggest violence or confrontation took place there. The vehicle did not contain obvious indicators that could reconstruct the final moments before it was abandoned. This lack of physical evidence created a significant limitation. Without forensic markers, the vehicle could not be used to establish a precise sequence of events. It could not confirm whether Peter Boyer left it voluntarily, whether he was removed from it, or whether it was abandoned under circumstances that did not involve direct confrontation. As a result, the vehicle remained an isolated piece of evidence, present but not explanatory. The investigative team faced the additional challenge of reconstructing a timeline without confirmed witness accounts. There were no reliable reports that placed Peter Boyer in a specific location after he left home that could be used as a fixed point in the investigation. In missing person cases, even a single credible sighting can help narrow down time frames and geographic focus. Here, the absence of such accounts meant that investigators could not build a progressive map of his movements. This lack of witnesses also meant that the investigation could not rely on external validation of his final known actions. No one could confirm his direction of travel, his behavior after leaving home, or any interactions that might have occurred during the critical early period of his disappearance. Without this layer of information, the investigation became increasingly dependent on indirect inference rather than direct observation. Communication records, another essential tool in missing person cases, also did not provide clarity. There is no documented evidence of phone calls, messages, or other forms of contact attributed to Peter Boyer after his departure. In cases where individuals disappear under unclear circumstances, communication often serves as a bridge between known and unknown periods. Even brief or seemingly insignificant messages can offer insight into mental state, location, or intent. In this case, that bridge is absent. The lack of communication eliminates another potential pathway for reconstructing the timeline. As investigators continued their work, they attempted to establish whether the disappearance could be explained through voluntary departure. This line of inquiry typically involves examining financial records, travel arrangements, personal behavior patterns, and any indications that an individual was planning to leave their life behind. In the case of Peter Boyer, the available information does not indicate that such preparatory actions took place. There is no evidence of large financial withdrawals or unusual transactions prior to his disappearance. There are no recorded arrangements for extended absence and no documented behavior suggesting a deliberate exit strategy. This absence of preparatory behavior complicates the voluntary disappearance hypothesis. While it does not eliminate it entirely, it weakens its explanatory strength. Voluntary disappearances, even when carefully planned, usually leave behind some trace of intention, whether logistical or behavioral. The lack of such traces in this case leaves a gap between possibility and evidence. At the same time, the investigation could not conclusively support the opposite hypothesis of forced disappearance. There were no confirmed reports of confrontation at the time of his departure. There was no physical evidence described that clearly indicated an abduction scenario. Without witnesses or forensic indicators pointing towards struggle or coercion, the forced disappearance model remained speculative rather than evidentially grounded. This dual limitation created a central investigative paradox. The two most common explanatory frameworks for missing persons, voluntary disappearance and forced disappearance, were both weakened by lack of supporting evidence. As a result, investigators were left operating within a narrow space where neither primary hypothesis could be confidently prioritized. The geographic and environmental context of Hawaii introduced additional complexity without providing resolution. The terrain, which includes dense natural areas, volcanic landscapes, and extensive coastal regions, can make physical searches difficult. However, the available information does not indicate that environmental factors directly contributed to locating or explaining Peter Boyer's disappearance. The environment functioned more as a background condition than an active explanatory element in the investigation. As time passed, the absence of new developments became a defining feature of the case. In many investigations, Initial uncertainty is gradually reduced through the accumulation of new evidence, witness statements, or forensic analysis. In this case, there is no indication that such progression occurred. The investigative trail appears to have reached a plateau relatively early, with no subsequent breakthroughs that altered the fundamental understanding of what happened. The case also suffered from the limitations of the period in which it occurred. In 1979, investigative technology and forensic capabilities were significantly less advanced than those available in later decades. While this fact alone does not determine the outcome of any case, it does shape the range of possible conclusions that can be drawn from limited evidence. Without advanced forensic tools, subtle traces that might have provided direction could not be fully analyzed or may not have been detectable at all. Despite these challenges, investigators were still able to establish certain boundaries around what did not happen, even if they could not determine what did. There is no indication that Peter Boyer engaged in a documented extended absence from his normal life prior to disappearance. There is no confirmed evidence of sustained communication after his departure. There is no verified sequence of movements that extends beyond the initial departure and the later discovery of his vehicle. These negative findings, while not explanatory in themselves, help define the limits of the known case. The investigative process ultimately became an exercise in managing absence. Each potential source of clarity, whether witness testimony, physical evidence, or communication records, was either missing or insufficient. This forced investigators into a position where they had to consider multiple possibilities simultaneously without being able to eliminate any of them through definitive evidence. Over time, the lack of progression led to the classification of the case as a cold case, meaning that active investigation ceased or significantly slowed due to lack of new leads. This status does not imply closure, but rather a recognition that available methods and evidence were insufficient to advance the case further. The file remains open in principle, but inactive in practice. The central challenge that remains is the inability to connect the known elements of the case into a coherent sequence. A man leaves home. A vehicle is later found abandoned in an unexpected location. No confirmed witnesses or communications fill the gap between these points. No forensic evidence clearly explains what occurred in that interval. The investigation, therefore, exists as a set of isolated facts without connective continuity. This lack of continuity is what defines the investigative state of the case. It is not a matter of competing theories supported by partial evidence, but rather a matter of insufficient evidence across all potential theories. The investigation does not converge toward a single explanation because it lacks the necessary data points to do so. What remains is a case defined by structural absence within the investigative record. Each attempted pathway toward resolution encounters the same limitation: missing information that cannot be reconstructed through available means. The vehicle, the timeline, the lack of witnesses, and the absence of communication all contribute to a situation where the investigation can document what is not known, but cannot definitively establish what occurred. The result is a case that remains open in memory but unresolved in fact, defined more by the boundaries of investigation than by the answers it was able to produce. The legal dimension of the disappearance of Peter Boyer is defined not by what occurred in a courtroom, but by what never reached one. In many criminal investigations, the progression from missing person case to formal charges and trial represents a structured pathway toward resolution. Evidence is gathered, suspects are identified, charges are filed, and the judicial process becomes the stage on which facts are tested and verified. In this case, however, that entire pathway was never fully activated. The investigation remained in the domain of uncertainty, and the legal system never transitioned from inquiry to prosecution. There is no record of an arrest connected to the disappearance of Peter Boyer. No individual was formally charged in relation to his case, and no legal proceedings were initiated that would have brought the matter into a courtroom setting. This absence of judicial activity is not unusual in cases where evidence is insufficient to establish probable cause. However, in this instance, it is particularly significant because it reflects the broader investigative reality: the absence of material proof capable of supporting a legal accusation. Without a suspect, the legal system cannot proceed. Criminal proceedings require a threshold of evidence that demonstrates not only that a crime may have occurred, but also that a specific individual may be responsible for it. In the case of Peter Boyer, the available information does not indicate that investigators were able to identify a person who could be formally linked to his disappearance through physical evidence, witness testimony, or documented interaction. As a result, no legal charges were ever filed. The discovery of his vehicle, while an important investigative development, did not translate into legal action. In a courtroom context, physical evidence must be accompanied by contextual interpretation that connects it to a suspect and a sequence of events. The vehicle in this case, as previously established, did not contain described forensic indicators that could definitively establish what occurred. It did not provide a direct link to an individual or a clearly defined act of violence. Without that connection, it could not serve as the foundation for prosecution. Legal proceedings also depend heavily on the reconstruction of timelines. Courts require a coherent narrative that establishes when events occurred, where they occurred, and how they are connected to the accused. In this case, the timeline remains fragmented. Peter Boyer's departure from home is the last clearly identified point, but everything beyond that moment lacks confirmed structure. The absence of a continuous timeline prevents the construction of a prosecutable narrative because the law requires continuity of causation, not isolated points of uncertainty. The question of jurisdictional action also arises in cases of disappearance, particularly when initial investigative efforts do not produce immediate results. Law enforcement agencies may continue to treat a missing person case as open, but without new evidence, the legal escalation process cannot advance. In Peter Boyer's case, there is no indication that the investigation produced sufficient findings to elevate the matter beyond its status as an unresolved disappearance. The absence of suspects or charges effectively halted any progression toward judicial review. From a legal perspective, one of the most significant barriers in this case is the lack of corpus delicti, the principle requiring proof that a crime has occurred before a person can be convicted of committing it. In disappearance cases, this typically involves evidence that the missing person has died and that their death resulted from criminal action. In the case of Peter Boyer, there is no confirmed evidence of death, nor is there evidence that clearly establishes criminal causation. Without this foundational requirement, the legal system cannot proceed to trial. This creates a situation in which the case remains permanently in an investigative state rather than a prosecutorial one. It exists within the boundaries of law enforcement inquiry, but never crosses into adjudication. The distinction is important because it reflects the difference between suspicion and legal accountability. While investigators may consider multiple possibilities regarding what happened, the legal system can only act when those possibilities are supported by admissible evidence. The absence of courtroom proceedings also means there is no formal legal testing of competing theories. In a trial, evidence is subjected to scrutiny, challenged by opposing arguments, and evaluated under established standards of proof. In this case, none of that process occurred. The theories surrounding Peter Boyer's disappearance remain untested in a judicial sense. They exist only within the investigative framework, not within the adversarial structure of the legal system. This lack of judicial engagement has long-term consequences for resolution. Without legal closure, cases often remain open in administrative terms even when investigative activity slows or stops. The classification of Peter Boyer's case as a cold case reflects this condition. It indicates that while the case is not officially closed, there is no active legal pathway toward resolution due to insufficient evidence. The role of evidence in this case is central to understanding why the legal process never advanced. In criminal law, evidence must meet standards of reliability, relevance, and admissibility. It must be capable of supporting a narrative that can withstand cross-examination and judicial scrutiny. The available information in this case, as described, does not meet those thresholds. The absence of forensic detail, witness confirmation, and communication records means there is no evidentiary chain that can be presented in court. Even the environmental and situational context of the disappearance does not provide legal traction. While the location and conditions in which the disappearance occurred may complicate physical searches, they do not in themselves establish legal causation. Courts do not operate on ambiguity. They require demonstrable linkage between actions and outcomes. In this case, that linkage is missing. The inability to identify a suspect is another defining factor in the legal status of the case. Without a person to charge, the justice system cannot proceed beyond preliminary investigation. Suspect identification typically relies on patterns of behavior, forensic evidence, or credible testimony. None of these elements are present in a form that allows for legal action. As a result, the case remains without an accused individual, which effectively prevents any progression into trial. It is also important to note that the passage of time further complicates legal resolution. As years pass without new evidence, the likelihood of obtaining admissible material diminishes. Witness memories fade, physical evidence deteriorates or is lost, and investigative leads become increasingly difficult to verify. Although the initial disappearance occurred in 1979, the long-term nature of the case means that even potential future legal action would face significant evidentiary challenges. Despite the absence of legal proceedings, the case continues to exist within the broader framework of unresolved investigations. It remains officially open in the sense that no definitive legal conclusion has been reached. However, without the necessary evidentiary foundation, the case does not progress toward trial or adjudication. It remains in a state of legal suspension, neither resolved nor actively pursued through judicial means. This status highlights an important aspect of criminal justice systems. Not all investigations culminate in legal resolution. Some cases remain permanently outside the courtroom due to the limits of available evidence. The disappearance of Peter Boyer is an example of such a case, where the gap between investigative possibility and legal requirement cannot be bridged. The absence of a trial also means there is no legal determination of what occurred. There is no verdict, no judicial finding of guilt or innocence, and no formal establishment of facts through adversarial process. The case exists entirely within the investigative domain, where conclusions remain provisional and unconfirmed. In practical terms, this means that the legal system has not provided closure for the disappearance. The absence of judicial resolution leaves the case in a condition where uncertainty persists indefinitely. Without the mechanisms of trial and verdict, there is no final legal narrative to replace the investigative ambiguity. Ultimately, the legal status of Peter Boyer's disappearance is defined by absence at every level of judicial structure. No arrest, no charges, no trial, and no verdict. Each stage that would normally guide a case toward resolution is missing, leaving the investigation without a legal endpoint. The system remains aware of the case, but unable to act upon it in a formal judicial capacity due to the limitations of evidence and the absence of prosecutable structure. The result is a case that exists outside the resolution mechanisms of law, suspended in a state where investigation continues in theory, but legal closure remains unreachable. The disappearance of Peter Boyer does not end in the way most narratives expect stories of missing persons to conclude. There is no confirmed resolution, no verified explanation, and no moment where uncertainty is replaced by established fact. Instead, what remains is a sustained absence that continues to shape how the case is understood decades later. In the absence of closure, the aftermath becomes its own kind of reality, one defined not by events that occurred, but by the consequences of what did not. For those connected to Peter Boyer, the immediate aftermath of his disappearance would have been marked by a shift from ordinary expectation to unresolved uncertainty. In most cases involving missing persons, the early days and weeks are defined by the belief that answers will arrive quickly, that the situation will resolve itself through discovery or return. But as time passes without confirmation, that expectation gradually transforms. The absence becomes persistent, and the lack of information begins to define daily life. While the specific emotional experiences of individuals connected to this case are not detailed in the available record, the structural pattern of such cases is well understood. Uncertainty replaces normalcy, and waiting becomes a long-term condition rather than a temporary state. What makes the case of Peter Boyer particularly enduring is the way in which it resists resolution at every level. Investigatively, there is no final breakthrough. Legally, there is no trial or verdict. Factually, there is no confirmed explanation of what happened after he left home. This convergence of absence across multiple domains creates a case that does not evolve toward closure over time, but instead remains fixed in its unresolved state. From an investigative standpoint, the case continues to exist as a cold case, meaning it remains officially open in principle but inactive in practice. This classification reflects a balance between acknowledgement and limitation. The case is not closed because no definitive conclusion has been reached, yet it is not actively progressing because there are no new evidentiary developments to pursue. It exists in a suspended condition within institutional memory, preserved but not advancing. The passage of time introduces another layer of complexity. As years become decades, the distance between the disappearance and the present increases the difficulty of recovering new information. Physical evidence, if it ever existed beyond what was initially documented, may no longer be accessible or usable. Witnesses who might have had indirect knowledge of events may no longer be available or may no longer recall details with sufficient clarity to contribute meaningfully to the investigation. In this way, time itself becomes a factor that reinforces the permanence of uncertainty. Despite this, the case continues to hold significance not because of what is known, but because of what remains unknown. The absence of a resolution creates a persistent question that does not diminish with time. Instead, it maintains its presence as an unresolved narrative gap. Peter Boyer's disappearance becomes defined less by the events of the day he vanished and more by the enduring lack of explanation that follows. One of the most striking aspects of the case is the consistency of its unresolved elements. There is no confirmed final sighting, no established sequence of events beyond his departure from home, no communication that bridges the gap between presence and absence, and no forensic reconstruction that provides a clear account of what occurred. Each of these missing elements contributes to a structure in which the case is defined by discontinuity rather than progression. The narrative does not develop toward resolution because it lacks the connective material required for such development. The discovery of his vehicle, while an important investigative moment, does not alter this fundamental condition. It remains a single point of reference without a broader explanatory context. It confirms that a physical object associated with him was recovered, but it does not explain the circumstances under which it was abandoned or its connection to subsequent events. As a result, it stands as evidence of interruption rather than conclusion. Over time, cases like this often take on a symbolic dimension within the communities and systems that remember them. They become examples of investigative limitation, illustrating how even structured investigative processes can encounter cases that resist resolution. In this sense, the disappearance of Peter Boyer is not only an individual event, but also a representation of the boundaries of knowledge within missing person investigations. It demonstrates how the absence of information can persist even within systems designed to produce clarity. The emotional weight of such cases is shaped by the persistence of unanswered questions. Unlike cases that reach resolution, whether through recovery or confirmed outcome, unresolved cases maintain a continuous presence in the background of institutional and personal memory. They do not conclude. They accumulate time. Each passing year does not close the gap, but rather extends it, reinforcing the sense that the missing explanation remains just out of reach. At the same time, the case also reflects the limitations of reconstruction. Without reliable evidence, any attempt to reconstruct events beyond the point of confirmed departure remains speculative. This constraint defines the boundaries of responsible interpretation. The available information allows for acknowledgement of what is missing, but not for definitive conclusions about what occurred in the absence of evidence. This distinction is crucial in understanding why the case remains open rather than resolved. The final question that emerges from the disappearance is not simply what happened to Peter Boyer, but why no trace of explanation has been recovered in the years that followed. This question does not point to a single investigative failure or missing piece of evidence. Instead, it reflects the broader reality that some cases do not produce the material necessary for closure. They remain suspended not because they are ignored, but because they lack the evidentiary structure required to move beyond uncertainty. In reflecting on the aftermath, It becomes clear that the most defining feature of this case is not a specific event, but the absence of resolution across every stage of inquiry. There is no confirmed narrative to replace uncertainty, no judicial determination to establish facts, and no investigative breakthrough to close the gap. The case remains exactly where it began in structural terms, defined by disappearance and sustained by unanswered questions. The legacy of Peter Boyer's disappearance is therefore not a conclusion, but a condition. It is the condition of unresolved absence, where a life that once followed a known path transitions into a state that cannot be fully reconstructed. In this condition, the passage of time does not diminish uncertainty, it preserves it. What remains is a case that continues to exist in the space between knowledge and absence, where the known facts end and the unknown begins, and where no additional information has yet been able to bridge that divide. The case of Peter Boyer does not end in the traditional sense of an investigation reaching its conclusion. Instead, it continues as a persistent absence within the historical record, a file that remains technically open but practically unresolved. Over time, cases like this often shift from active investigation into a quieter state of existence, where they are no longer shaped by new evidence or developments, but by the absence of them. What remains is not a progression toward truth, but a static configuration of incomplete information that resists resolution. In the years following his disappearance, the structure of the case did not fundamentally change. No confirmed sightings emerged that could extend the timeline of his known movements. No communication was ever definitively attributed to him after the moment he left home. No suspect was identified in a way that could meet the threshold required for formal accusation or judicial process. The vehicle that was discovered early in the investigation remained one of the few physical anchors in the entire case, yet even that object did not evolve into a source of definitive answers. It marked a point of interruption, not a point of explanation. As time passed, the disappearance began to exist in a different context. It was no longer treated as an active unfolding event, but as a historical case that had reached a state of informational stasis. In investigative terms, this shift is significant because it represents the transition from inquiry to archival status. When a case enters this condition, it is not closed, but it is no longer driven by operational momentum. It becomes a reference point within a broader system of unresolved disappearances, preserved but not progressing. For those studying or reviewing such cases later, what becomes most striking is not what is present in the record, but what is absent from it. The absence of a confirmed final interaction means there is no definitive starting point for reconstructing his last known movements beyond his departure from home. The absence of communication removes any opportunity to trace intent, confusion, or external influence. The absence of forensic detail limits the ability to determine whether any physical confrontation occurred. Each missing element does not simply create a gap, it removes an entire layer of interpretive possibility. In cases where resolution is achieved, even after long periods, it is usually because one or more of these gaps eventually becomes filled. A witness is found, a piece of evidence is reinterpreted, or a technological advancement allows for new analysis of old material. In the case of Peter Boyer, none of these developments are documented. The investigative structure remains unchanged from its early stages, defined by the same core facts that were established shortly after his disappearance. This constancy creates a unique form of narrative stillness. The case does not evolve into contradiction or revision. Instead, it remains fixed in its original uncertainty. That stability of uncertainty is what makes it enduring. There are no competing resolved theories to replace the unknown. There is only the continued acknowledgement that the available information is insufficient to reach a conclusion. Over time, missing person cases often become categorized not only by their investigative status, but also by their degree of informational completeness. Some cases contain partial reconstructions, where at least segments of the timeline can be confidently established. Others contain strong suspect profiles or circumstantial frameworks that suggest likely outcomes even if they cannot be fully proven. The disappearance of Peter Boyer does not appear to fall into either of these categories based on the information provided. Instead, It remains closer to a minimal information case structure, where the known facts are limited to a departure, a disappearance, and a later discovery of an abandoned vehicle that does not fully explain the transition between those points. This structural minimalism is what makes the case particularly resistant to reinterpretation. With fewer data points, there is less material available for reevaluation or analytical reconstruction. As a result, the case does not generate new theories through reinterpretation of evidence because there is no substantial expansion of evidence to reinterpret. It remains anchored to its original informational boundaries. In the absence of resolution, cases like this often take on a reflective function within investigative practice. They become examples of the limits of inquiry, demonstrating how even structured investigative systems can reach points where available information is insufficient to produce closure. This does not imply failure in a procedural sense, but rather highlights the dependency of investigative outcomes on the presence of recoverable evidence. Without that evidence, even well-established methods cannot produce definitive answers. From a broader perspective, the disappearance of Peter Boyer also reflects the relationship between time and unresolved events. Time does not inherently resolve uncertainty. Instead, it alters the conditions under which uncertainty exists. As years pass, the likelihood of recovering new primary evidence decreases, while the interpretive distance between the present and the original event increases. This does not change the facts of the case, but it changes the context in which those facts are understood. The disappearance becomes less a recent investigative challenge and more a historical, unresolved anomaly. Despite this shift in temporal context, the central structure of the case remains unchanged. A man leaves home under normal conditions. No confirmed evidence establishes his movements afterward. A vehicle is later found abandoned without explanatory details sufficient to reconstruct the intervening events. No legal resolution is reached, and no confirmed explanation emerges. These elements remain constant across time, unaffected by the passage of decades. What is particularly notable is that the absence of resolution does not diminish the case's presence within investigative memory. Instead, it stabilizes it. The lack of closure prevents the case from being fully archived as concluded history. It remains in a suspended category, neither active nor resolved, maintained within records because its fundamental questions remain unanswered. In reflecting on such cases, it becomes clear that the most enduring aspect is not the search for explanation, but the persistence of unresolved absence itself. The disappearance of Peter Boyer does not function as a narrative with an ending. It functions as a condition that continues to exist within the boundaries of recorded history. That condition is defined by the separation between what is known and what is not, and by the inability of available evidence to bridge that separation. Even without new developments, the case continues to hold a place within the broader landscape of unresolved disappearances. It serves as a reminder that not all investigative paths lead to resolution, and that some events remain permanently positioned at the edge of what can be known. The absence at the center of the case does not diminish over time. Instead, it becomes the defining feature of its existence. Ultimately, what remains is not a story that concludes, but a record that persists. The disappearance of Peter Boyer continues to exist as an unresolved point within historical and investigative frameworks, defined entirely by the absence of closure and the endurance of unanswered questions that have not been resolved by time, evidence, or inquiry. The disappearance of Peter Boyer continues to exist as a case defined not by resolution, but by endurance. Over time, certain investigations stop behaving like active inquiries and begin functioning instead as fixed points within institutional memory. They are not concluded, but neither are they advancing. They remain suspended between what is known and what cannot be proven, preserved in record but unresolved in meaning. The case of Peter Boyer belongs firmly within this category, where time has not clarified events and investigation has not produced a final answer. What makes this case persist in that state is not a lack of attention, but a lack of transformation in its core facts. The foundational elements of the case have remained unchanged since the earliest stages of inquiry. A man left home under ordinary circumstances. There was no confirmed indication of distress or preparation for disappearance. No verified communication followed his departure. No consistent eyewitness account established his movements after he left. A vehicle connected to him was later found abandoned, but it did not contain evidence that could reconstruct the sequence of events. These facts, limited as they are, have not evolved into a more detailed narrative despite the passage of time. In many long-term missing person cases, new information eventually shifts the direction of understanding. A previously unknown witness may come forward. A piece of physical evidence may be re-examined with improved methods. A timeline may be refined through indirect data that was not originally considered. In this case, however, there is no indication in the available record that such developments occurred. The structure of the case remains essentially identical to its original form, with no documented expansion of verified facts. This creates a unique condition in which the case is not actively changing, but continuously existing in a state of informational stasis. That stasis does not mean inactivity in a literal sense, but rather the absence of new definitional input. The known elements neither increase nor decrease, they simply remain fixed. Over time, this produces a kind of narrative rigidity, where the boundaries of the case are clearly defined but internally incomplete. The absence of a confirmed last sighting continues to be one of the most significant limitations in understanding what happened. Without that anchor point, the transition from known presence to unknown absence cannot be precisely located in time. The disappearance cannot be mapped along a continuous timeline because the final segment of that timeline is undefined. This is not merely a missing detail, it is the structural break that prevents full reconstruction of events. Similarly, the lack of communication after his departure remains a defining feature of the case. In most missing person investigations, even when individuals are not immediately located, some form of contact or traceable interaction provides continuity. It may be indirect or fragmented, but it often exists in some form. In this case, the absence of any confirmed communication removes that continuity entirely. There is no transitional signal between presence and absence, only discontinuity. The vehicle, discovered during the investigation, remains an important but limited artifact within the case. It confirms that a physical object associated with Peter Boyer was recovered, but it does not extend the narrative of events in a meaningful way. It does not contain documented evidence of what occurred after his departure, nor does it provide a clear indication of sequence or cause. It functions as a point of evidence, without becoming a source of explanation. As years pass, the emotional and investigative framing of such cases often shifts. What was once an active search becomes a historical reference. What was once a pressing question becomes a persistent unknown. Yet the underlying facts do not change. The case remains defined by the same core absence that existed at its inception. This continuity of uncertainty is what gives the case its lasting presence. From an analytical perspective, the disappearance highlights the limitations inherent in reconstructing events when foundational data is incomplete. Investigations rely on chains of evidence that connect actions to outcomes. When those chains are broken at their earliest stages, reconstruction becomes increasingly speculative. In this case, the break occurs immediately after departure, leaving no reliable intermediate steps to guide interpretation. The passage of time does not resolve this structural issue. Instead, it reinforces it. As years accumulate without new verified evidence, the distance between the present and the original event increases. This distance reduces the likelihood of recovering new primary information, not because the case becomes less important, but because the conditions necessary for generating new evidence become less accessible. Memory fades, physical traces degrade, and opportunities for direct recovery diminish. Despite this, the case remains formally unresolved. It continues to exist within investigative records as an open matter, not because new activity is ongoing, but because no conclusive determination has been made. This status reflects an important distinction between closure and conclusion. Closure would require a definitive explanation supported by evidence. Conclusion would require only the end of active inquiry. In this case, neither has fully occurred. What remains most striking about the disappearance is its simplicity at the surface level and its resistance to interpretation beneath that surface. The known facts are few and clearly defined, yet those facts do not naturally extend into a coherent explanation. They do not form a continuous narrative that can be followed from beginning to end. Instead, they form isolated points that do not connect through verified information. This structure creates a lasting investigative challenge. Without connection, there is no progression. Without progression, there is no resolution. And without resolution, the case remains in a permanent state of incompleteness. It is this incompleteness, rather than any specific detail, that defines the disappearance of Peter Boyer. Over time, cases like this take on a different kind of significance. They are not remembered for dramatic developments or final revelations, but for their persistence as unresolved questions. They demonstrate that even in structured investigative systems, there are limits to what can be known when information is absent from the beginning. They exist as reminders that not all disappearances can be reconstructed, and not all absences can be explained. In the final analysis, the case of Peter Boyer does not move toward resolution because it does not contain the necessary components for resolution within the available record. It remains anchored to a small set of known facts that do not expand into a complete narrative. Those facts describe departure, disappearance, and the discovery of an abandoned vehicle, but they do not describe what connects those points together. What remains, therefore, is not a solved case or an approaching conclusion, but a stable and unchanging absence. The disappearance continues to exist in that form, defined by what is not known as much as by what is recorded. It is a case that persists not because it is actively unfolding, but because it has never reached a point where its unknown elements could be replaced by verified understanding. The disappearance of Peter Boyer remains one of those cases that does not resolve itself neatly into conclusion, not because it is especially complex in terms of documented evidence, but because it never produced enough evidence to allow a conclusion at all. It exists in a space where the investigative record is complete in structure, but incomplete in substance, where every procedural step that normally leads toward understanding was initiated, but never fully satisfied by information. Over time, that absence of resolution becomes the defining feature of the case itself, more than any individual detail recorded at the beginning of the investigation. The core facts remain unchanged from the earliest stages. Peter Boyer left his home on what was described as a normal day in 1979 in Honolulu. There is no verified indication that anything about his behavior suggested an imminent disappearance. He carried no documented preparation for an extended absence, and there is no confirmed communication after his departure that would establish a clear continuation of his movements. At some point following this departure, he ceased to appear in any traceable or confirmed form within the available record. Later, his vehicle was discovered abandoned in a location that did not align with his expected routine, but the condition of that vehicle did not provide explanatory evidence regarding what had occurred. These facts form the entire known skeleton of the case. Everything else is interpretation, inference, or absence. And in this case, absence is not just a gap within the record. It is the record. In many investigations, the process of understanding a disappearance depends on accumulation. One detail leads to another, and each piece of evidence builds upon the last until a coherent sequence emerges. Even when the outcome is not immediately clear, there is usually a gradual narrowing of possibilities. In the case of Peter Boyer, that narrowing never fully occurs. The available information does not converge toward a single explanation. Instead, it disperses, with each potential direction weakening under the weight of missing corroboration. The discovery of his vehicle is often the only physical anchor in the case, but even that anchor does not stabilize interpretation. It confirms a point of interruption, not a cause. It indicates that something happened between departure and discovery, but it does not define what that something was. Without additional physical evidence, the vehicle remains a silent object within the investigation, present but uninformative, fixed in place but disconnected from a broader sequence of events. The absence of confirmed witnesses is equally significant. No verified account places Peter Boyer in a situation that can be reliably used as a final sighting. Without that final point of confirmation, the timeline remains open-ended at its most critical moment. Investigations depend heavily on the ability to establish a last known position or interaction, because that point becomes the foundation from which all reconstruction begins. In this case, that foundation is unstable or missing entirely, and so every attempt to reconstruct events must begin from an incomplete base. Communication records, which often serve as secondary anchors in missing person cases, also provide no extension of the narrative. There is no confirmed message, call, or interaction after his departure that would allow investigators to trace movement, intent, or state of mind. This absence removes another layer of continuity that would normally help bridge the gap between presence and disappearance. What remains is not a fragmented timeline, but a broken one, where continuity cannot be reliably established at any point beyond the initial departure. Over the years, the case has remained in a static investigative condition. It has not progressed into resolution, nor has it been redefined by new evidence that changes its structure. It exists in the category commonly referred to as a cold case, but even within that category, it is defined less by inactivity and more by informational limitation. There is no known suspect, no confirmed sequence of events beyond the initial disappearance, and no forensic reconstruction that provides clarity regarding what occurred after he left home. This lack of progression has a cumulative effect over time. As years pass without new developments, the case does not become more complex. It becomes more fixed. The absence of new evidence does not generate new interpretations so much as it reinforces the boundaries of what is already known. Those boundaries remain narrow, defined by departure, disappearance, and the later discovery of an abandoned vehicle, with no confirmed bridge between them. From an investigative standpoint, this creates a condition where the case cannot be advanced through conventional means. Without witnesses, forensic data, or communication records, there is no material through which to test competing hypotheses. Voluntary disappearance cannot be confirmed because there is no evidence of planning or continuation. Forced disappearance cannot be confirmed because there is no documented confrontation or physical trace of such an event. Both possibilities remain theoretically open, but neither can be grounded in verifiable detail. The passage of time introduces another dimension, not by altering the facts, but by reducing the likelihood that new facts will emerge. Investigations depend on the preservation and recovery of evidence, and as time increases, the probability of recovering additional meaningful information decreases. This does not close the case, but it stabilizes its uncertainty. What was once an active investigative question becomes a historical, unresolved condition. Despite this, the case of Peter Boyer continues to hold significance precisely because it does not resolve. It stands as an example of the limits of reconstruction when foundational data is absent. It demonstrates that even in structured investigative systems, there are cases that do not yield to procedural resolution because the necessary inputs for resolution were never fully available. In such cases, the investigation does not fail in a dramatic sense. It simply reaches the boundary of what can be known. What remains is a disappearance defined not by what is known about the event, but by what cannot be recovered from it. The absence is not a single missing detail, but a structural condition that spans the entire case. Every known element points toward interruption without explanation, and every investigative pathway returns to the same limitation: insufficient information to establish continuity. In the end, the case does not conclude. It persists, not as an active mystery being solved, and not as a resolved historical fact, but as an unresolved record that continues to exist within investigative memory. The disappearance of Peter Boyer remains what it has always been since the moment it was first recognized, a transition from presence to absence that was never fully observed, never fully documented, and never fully explained. The disappearance of Peter Boyer does not resolve itself in the way that most cases eventually do, where time, evidence, or testimony converges into a conclusion that can be stated with certainty. Instead, it remains fixed in a state that is defined entirely by discontinuity. From the moment he left his home in 1979 in Honolulu, The investigative record contains only fragments that do not connect into a continuous sequence. A departure, a lack of confirmed sighting, an absence of communication. And then, later, the discovery of an abandoned vehicle that suggests interruption but not explanation. These elements exist, but they do not combine into a narrative that can be completed. What defines this case is not the presence of contradictory evidence, but the absence of connecting evidence. There is no verified transition between his known life and his disappearance. No documented interaction that bridges the gap between leaving home and vanishing from traceable record. No forensic reconstruction that establishes what occurred in the intervening period. Each known point stands isolated, and between those points, there is silence that cannot be filled by inference alone. In most missing person investigations, the structure of the case gradually builds over time. Even when immediate answers are not available, evidence tends to accumulate in ways that narrow possibilities. Witnesses may recall details later. Physical evidence may be reinterpreted. Communication records may reveal patterns that were not initially obvious. In this case, none of those progressive mechanisms appear to have taken hold in a way that altered the fundamental structure of what is known. The case does not expand outward into clarity. It remains confined to its original limits. The vehicle that was discovered during the investigation is often treated as the only tangible link to the disappearance, but even that object does not function as a narrative bridge. It confirms that Peter Boyer's presence extended beyond his departure from home, but it does not explain how or why his traceable presence ended. It contains no described forensic detail that reconstructs an event. It does not establish direction, intent, or cause. It marks location without providing meaning. The absence of confirmed witnesses is equally defining. There is no reliable account that places him in a final known interaction that can be used to anchor a timeline. Without such an anchor, the investigation loses its most essential structural component, a final confirmed point of reference. Everything prior to that point is known only in general terms, and everything after becomes unbounded. The result is not a fragmented timeline, but a broken one, where continuity cannot be reconstructed. Communication records, which often serve as secondary anchors in disappearance cases, also provide no extension of the narrative. There is no verified message, call, or documented interaction that can be attributed to him after his departure. This removes another layer of potential continuity that might otherwise help narrow the scope of investigation. Without communication, there is no behavioral trace, no emotional signal, and no logistical indicator of movement or intent. As the investigation moved forward in its early stages, it encountered a limitation that would define its long-term trajectory: the absence of actionable evidence. Without witnesses, without forensic reconstruction, and without communication data, there is no material through which competing explanations can be tested. In such conditions, investigative hypotheses remain theoretical rather than evidential. They exist as possibilities, not conclusions. The passage of time does not resolve this limitation. Instead, it reinforces it. As years pass without new verified information, the likelihood of recovering additional evidence decreases. This is not because the case becomes less important, but because the conditions required for new discovery diminish over time. Memory fades. Physical traces degrade. Contextual connections are lost. What remains becomes increasingly fixed in its original form. This is why the case of Peter Boyer has not evolved into resolution. It is not a case that was overturned by later evidence, nor one that shifted direction through investigative breakthrough. It is a case that has remained structurally unchanged since its earliest documentation. The known facts have not expanded into a fuller narrative, and the unknown elements have not been replaced by explanation. What persists instead is a condition of informational suspension. The case exists within official memory, preserved as unresolved, but without active progression toward conclusion. It is neither closed nor advancing. It occupies a space where investigative identity is maintained, but investigative momentum is absent. From a broader perspective, this kind of case illustrates a fundamental boundary within investigative systems. There are cases that can be resolved through accumulation of evidence, and there are cases that cannot progress beyond their initial constraints because the necessary evidence was never available or was never recovered. The disappearance of Peter Boyer belongs to the latter category. It demonstrates that the effectiveness of investigation is ultimately dependent on the existence of traceable data, and when that data is absent, even structured investigative processes reach their limit. The emotional and narrative impact of such cases does not come from dramatic revelation or final discovery. It comes from permanence of uncertainty. The absence does not diminish over time. It does not resolve into clarity through repetition or reconsideration. Instead, it remains stable, unchanged by duration, resistant to reinterpretation because there is no new material to reinterpret. What remains at the center of this case is a simple but unresolved sequence. A man leaves home. He is not confirmed again through reliable sighting or communication. A vehicle associated with him is later found abandoned. Beyond that point, there is no verified reconstruction of events. This sequence does not form a complete narrative. It forms a boundary around what is known, and beyond that boundary, there is no confirmed information to extend it further. In the end, the disappearance of Peter Boyer is defined not by what happened, but by what cannot be recovered about what happened. It is a case that does not move toward conclusion because it lacks the informational structure required for conclusion to exist. It remains, in its final form, an unresolved disappearance contained entirely within the limits of incomplete evidence, unchanged by time, and unaltered by the absence of resolution. The disappearance of Peter Boyer ultimately remains in the category of cases that do not resolve through time, investigation, or procedural closure. It does not reach a point where evidence accumulates into certainty, and it does not transition into a confirmed explanation that can replace uncertainty with fact. Instead, it stabilizes in a condition where the known elements of the case remain permanently separated from the unknown elements by a gap that has never been bridged. From the beginning, the structure of the case is defined by a very small number of verified points. Peter Boyer left his home in Honolulu in 1979 under ordinary conditions. There is no confirmed indication that his departure was preceded by unusual behavior or external pressure. There is no documented communication that follows his departure that can be reliably attributed to him. There is no confirmed witness account that places him in a final identifiable interaction after leaving home. At a later point, his vehicle was discovered abandoned in a location that did not correspond with his expected movement, but the condition of that vehicle did not provide explanatory details sufficient to reconstruct what occurred. These elements form the entire factual foundation of the case. Everything beyond them is absence. And that absence is not incidental, it is structural. In most missing person investigations, even those that remain unsolved for long periods, there is usually at least one expanding layer of evidence. A partial witness account, a trace of communication, a financial transaction, or a forensic detail that allows investigators to extend the timeline beyond the initial disappearance. These extensions do not always lead to resolution, but they usually allow the case to develop in complexity. In the case of Peter Boyer, that expansion does not occur. The case does not develop outward. It remains confined within its original boundaries. The vehicle that was recovered is often the only physical anchor, but it does not function as a narrative bridge. It confirms presence at a point after departure, but it does not explain the transition from presence to absence. It does not contain documented evidence of struggle, planned departure, or forced removal. It exists as a physical object disconnected from a verified sequence of events. Because of that, it does not resolve ambiguity. It preserves it. The absence of confirmed witnesses further reinforces this condition. Without a verified last sighting, there is no anchor point from which to reconstruct a final timeline. Investigations rely heavily on such anchor points because they allow investigators to move backward and forward through time with reference to known events. Without that anchor, the timeline becomes unstructured at its most critical moment. The disappearance is not framed by a final interaction, but by a final absence of interaction. Communication records also provide no extension of the narrative. There is no confirmed call, message, or traceable contact after the departure. This eliminates one of the most common ways in which missing person cases are reconstructed through indirect signals that establish intent, movement, or condition. In this case, there is no such signal. The silence is total from the point of departure onward. As a result, the investigative process is left with limited tools. Without witnesses, communication, or forensic reconstruction, there is no evidentiary chain that can be used to test competing hypotheses. Voluntary disappearance cannot be confirmed because there is no evidence of planning or continuation. Forced disappearance cannot be confirmed because there is no documented confrontation or physical trace indicating such an event. Both possibilities remain theoretically open, but neither can be substantiated. The passage of time does not alter this structure. It only stabilizes it. As years pass without new verified evidence, the probability of recovering additional information decreases. Not because the case becomes less significant, but because the conditions required for generating new information naturally diminish. Memory fades. Physical evidence degrades or is lost. Contexts that might have supported interpretation disappear. What remains is the original informational boundary of the case, unchanged. This is why the disappearance of Peter Boyer remains unresolved in a permanent sense. It is not a case that moves toward conclusion and fails. It is a case that never gains the evidentiary structure required for conclusion to exist in the first place. The investigative system can document the absence, but it cannot fill it without material input that does not exist in the record. The result is a case that exists in a suspended state. It is not active in terms of ongoing investigation, and it is not closed in terms of legal or factual resolution. It remains preserved as an unresolved record, defined entirely by the separation between known events and unknown outcomes. At its core, the case can be reduced to a single unresolved transition. A person is present within a known environment. He leaves under ordinary conditions. After that moment, there is no confirmed trace that can reconstruct what followed. That transition from presence to absence is the central and only structural movement in the case, and it is the point at which all investigative pathways end. Everything else in the record exists around that gap, not inside it. The investigation describes the absence, but it cannot penetrate it. It records the disappearance, but it does not explain it. It preserves the facts, but it does not complete them. In the final analysis, the disappearance of Peter Boyer is defined not by complexity, but by incompleteness. It is a case that does not resolve because the information required to resolve it was never recovered. And as long as that condition remains unchanged, the case will remain exactly what it has always been since the moment it entered the record, an unresolved disappearance existing permanently at the edge of what is known, and what cannot be known from the evidence that remains. The disappearance of Peter Boyer remains unresolved not because of conflicting evidence, but because of the absence of evidence that could support resolution in the first place. Across the entirety of the investigative record, there is a consistent structural limitation that defines the case from beginning to end. That limitation is not uncertainty created by contradiction, but uncertainty created by incompleteness. The available facts do not compete with one another. They simply do not extend far enough to form a complete narrative. The known sequence begins with a departure. Peter Boyer leaves his home in Honolulu in 1979 under circumstances that do not indicate distress or disruption. There is no confirmed evidence of preparatory behavior suggesting planned disappearance, nor is there documentation of external pressure or escalating conflict that might explain sudden absence. From that moment of departure, the record becomes fragmented. No verified communication follows. No confirmed sighting establishes a continued traceable path. The timeline does not progress in measurable steps. Instead, it breaks. At a later point, his vehicle is discovered abandoned. This is the only physical artifact that directly connects his known life to the unknown period that follows his departure. However, the condition and contents of that vehicle, as described in the investigative record, do not provide explanatory details sufficient to reconstruct the events that occurred between departure and abandonment. The vehicle confirms interruption but does not define cause, sequence, or outcome. It is a static endpoint within the investigation, not a bridge between known and unknown. This absence of continuity is the defining characteristic of the entire case. In most missing person investigations, even when resolution is delayed or never fully achieved, there are usually incremental points of reference that allow partial reconstruction. Witness accounts, financial activity, communication traces, or forensic indicators typically provide fragments that extend the timeline beyond the moment of disappearance. In the case of Peter Boyer, those extensions do not appear in the documented record. The investigative structure does not expand outward. It remains confined to its initial boundaries. The lack of a confirmed last sighting is particularly significant because it removes the critical anchor point required for chronological reconstruction. Without a verified final interaction, investigators cannot establish a precise moment from which to measure subsequent events. The disappearance therefore exists without a fixed temporal boundary beyond the departure itself. Everything after that point is undefined in both time and sequence. Communication records, which often serve as secondary anchors in missing person cases, also do not contribute to extending the timeline. There is no verified contact after departure that can be attributed to Peter Boyer. This eliminates one of the most common forms of post-disappearance traceability. Without communication, there is no behavioral signal, no logistical indicator, and no indirect pathway through which movement or intent can be inferred. The investigative process, when faced with such limitations, must rely heavily on physical evidence. Yet in this case, physical evidence beyond the abandoned vehicle is not documented in a way that allows reconstruction. There are no described forensic findings that establish interaction, struggle, or environmental context sufficient to determine what occurred. As a result, the physical layer of the investigation does not resolve ambiguity, it maintains it. From a legal and procedural standpoint, the absence of suspect identification further reinforces the structural incompleteness of the case. Without a suspect, there can be no formal charges, no adversarial testing of evidence, and no judicial examination of competing theories. The case remains entirely within the investigative domain, where possibilities can be considered but not legally adjudicated. This absence of legal transition reflects the same underlying limitations seen throughout the case: insufficient evidence to progress beyond preliminary stages. Over time, cases of this nature do not typically evolve toward resolution unless new information emerges. However, in this instance, there is no documented emergence of additional evidence that alters the foundational structure of the case. The known facts remain fixed. The disappearance remains anchored to a single departure event and a later discovery of an abandoned vehicle with no intervening verified sequence. The passage of time does not change the content of the case, but it does change its interpretive context. As years pass without resolution, the case shifts from active investigative concern to historical unresolved status. This shift does not bring closure, it formalizes absence of progress. The case remains open in classification but inactive in function. It is preserved in record, but not advanced in investigation. What makes the disappearance of Peter Boyer particularly persistent in investigative memory is not complexity, but clarity of limitation. The case does not contain competing narratives that must be reconciled. It contains a single unresolved break in continuity. That break cannot be filled because the necessary connecting data does not exist in the available record. This creates a condition where the investigative outcome is not uncertain because of conflicting interpretation, but because of missing structure. At its core, the case can be understood as a transition that was never observed beyond its initial point. A known presence becomes unknown without documented intermediary stages. The absence is not explained by evidence, and the evidence does not expand beyond the initial disappearance event. Everything that follows exists outside verified record. In this sense, the case does not move toward conclusion because it does not contain the informational architecture required for conclusion to be constructed. There is no continuous chain of events, no verified sequence of interactions, and no reconstructed pathway between departure and disappearance. The investigation can describe what is missing, but it cannot recover what is absent from the historical record. Ultimately, The disappearance of Peter Boyer remains defined by a single enduring condition: the separation between known departure and unknown outcome. That separation has not been bridged by evidence, time, or investigation. It persists unchanged across decades, not as a developing mystery, but as a fixed absence within the record. And in the end, that is what the case becomes. Not a story that reaches resolution, but a documented disappearance that remains permanently suspended at the point where knowledge ends and explanation never begins. The disappearance of Peter Boyer does not evolve into a solved case, and it does not reach the kind of narrative closure that allows a definitive explanation to replace uncertainty. Instead, it remains defined entirely by the limits of what was ever recorded about it. From the beginning, the case contains only a narrow set of confirmed facts. Peter Boyer leaves his home in Honolulu in 1979. There is no verified indication of distress or preparation suggesting disappearance. After that departure, there is no confirmed communication, no reliable witness account that continues the timeline, and no documented sequence of movements that can be reconstructed with certainty. At a later point, his vehicle is found abandoned, but it does not provide evidence that explains what occurred in the interval between departure and discovery. These are the only stable points in the entire case. Everything else exists as absence around them. In most missing person investigations, even those that remain unsolved, the structure of the case tends to expand over time. Additional fragments appear, allowing investigators to refine timelines, eliminate possibilities, or at least narrow uncertainty. A sighting is confirmed, a financial record emerges, or a communication trace provides a partial bridge between known and unknown events. In the case of Peter Boyer, none of these expansions occur in the documented record. The case does not grow outward. It remains confined to its initial limitations. The absence of a confirmed last sighting is one of the most critical elements in this structure. Without a final verified point of contact, there is no anchor from which the investigation can reliably reconstruct subsequent events. The disappearance is not framed by a known transition point beyond departure, which means the timeline does not collapse inward from a defined endpoint. Instead, it dissolves immediately after the moment he leaves home, leaving no structured sequence behind. Communication records, which often provide continuity in missing person cases, also do not extend the narrative. There is no verified message, call, or interaction attributed to Peter Boyer after his departure. This removes one of the most common forms of post-disappearance traceability. Without communication, there is no behavioral signal that can be analyzed for intent, location, or emotional state. The investigative process loses one of its primary interpretive tools. The discovery of the vehicle introduces the only physical object tied directly to the case, but even this object does not function as a reconstructive element. It confirms that Peter Boyer's presence extended beyond his departure from home, but it does not provide a mechanism for understanding what interrupted that presence. It contains no documented forensic detail that establishes sequence, cause, or interaction. It exists as evidence of location, not explanation. Because of these limitations, the investigative process remains structurally incomplete. Without witnesses, there is no external confirmation of movement. Without communication, there is no internal trace of intent. Without forensic reconstruction, there is no physical narrative that can be followed. Each layer that normally contributes to case development is either missing or insufficient. Over time, this creates a condition in which the case does not remain active in a traditional sense, but it also does not close. It enters a suspended state where it is preserved in record but not advanced in understanding. The classification of cold case reflects this condition, but does not resolve it. It simply acknowledges that no further progress has been made within the available framework. The passage of time reinforces this structure rather than changing it. As years pass, the likelihood of recovering new primary evidence decreases. Witness memory fades, physical traces are lost, and contextual connections that might once have existed become inaccessible. The case does not evolve into clarity, it stabilizes into permanence of uncertainty. What defines this disappearance most clearly is not complexity, but incompleteness. The known facts do not contradict each other. They simply do not extend far enough to form a continuous narrative. There is no competing explanation that must be resolved. There is only a gap between departure and outcome that has never been bridged by evidence. In that sense, the case does not fail to reach resolution. It never acquires the informational structure required for resolution to become possible. The investigative record begins with a departure and ends with an absence that cannot be filled by verified data. Everything in between remains unobserved, unrecorded, and unreconstructed. The final condition of the case is therefore defined by static separation, a known point of departure on one side and an unknown outcome on the other, with no confirmed connection between them. This separation is not something that time resolves. It is something that time preserves. And so the disappearance of Peter Boyer remains what it has always been since the moment it was first recorded, a case that does not conclude because the information required to conclude it was never present in the record.